The boy's voice broke across the silence of the Sunday afternoon like a stone through glass, and Caroline Townsend felt every muscle in her body go absolutely still. "Papa," said 8-year-old Eli Wilcox, his small hand tugging at the hem of his father's worn leather vest, his dark eyes wide and serious in the way that only children can manage when they mean something with every fiber of their being. "Can Miss Caroline be our family? Can she stay here forever and be our mama?" The question hung in the dry Texas air like smoke that refused to dissipate, and Caroline felt the blood drain from her face even as her heart slammed so hard against her ribs she was certain both man and boy could hear it. She was standing in the yard of the Wilcox Ranch, her carpetbag still dusty from 2 days of stagecoach travel, her dress wrinkled and her hair barely held together by pins that had given up fighting the wind somewhere around Abilene. She had nowhere to go. She had nothing left. And now this child, this heartbreakingly earnest little boy who had taken exactly 45 minutes to decide she was the most important person in the world, had just asked the one question that could destroy everything she had barely begun to build. She forced herself to look at Clayton Wilcox. He was standing 3 feet from her, his hat in his hand. His jaw set in the way she had already learned meant he was working very hard not to feel something. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and hands that were scarred from decades of honest, brutal work. His eyes were the particular shade of gray that looked like storm clouds rolling in off the plains, and right now they were fixed on his son, with an expression that made Caroline's chest ache in ways she had not experienced since the life she had left behind in Missouri had crumbled to dust around her feet. Clayton Wilcox, she had already discovered in 48 hours, was a man who could not lie to his son, and he could not say no to either one of them. She had arrived in Bitter Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1878, and she had arrived desperate. That was the truth she had not written in the advertisement. When the Bitter Creek Gazette had run the notice seeking a housekeeper and cook for the Wilcox Ranch, a widower with a young son, experience preferred, references required, Caroline had responded with a letter that was every bit as carefully constructed as a wall built to keep out the weather. She had mentioned her experience in domestic work. She had mentioned her cooking. She had not mentioned that she was fleeing a dark past that had followed her from Missouri like a shadow with teeth, that the references she had provided were from people who did not know the full story, and that when she stepped onto the westbound stage in Independence, she had exactly $4.32 to her name and a secret that could unravel everything if the wrong person asked the right question. What she had not expected was the child, or the way the child would look at her, or the way his father would look at her when he thought she was not watching. But to understand how Caroline Townsend came to be standing in that dusty yard on that Sunday afternoon, with a little boy's question reshaping the entire architecture of her future, you had to go back to the morning she arrived. She had stepped off the stage in Bitter Creek on a Wednesday morning when the October sky was the impossible blue that only appears in West Texas, where the land is so flat and the horizon so distant that the sky feels like a physical weight pressing down. The town itself was small, the kind of settlement that existed because the railroad had decided it should, with a general store, a livery, a bank that looked newer than everything else, 3 saloons, a church whose whitewashed walls were already peeling from the sun, and a scattering of homes that suggested optimism rather than prosperity. Clayton Wilcox had been waiting by the stage depot, leaning against a post with his arms crossed, scanning the passengers with the methodical patience of a man who had learned to wait for things that might not come. He was wearing a clean shirt, which she would later learn was the most formal gesture he was capable of making, and when she climbed down from the stage with her carpetbag and her reticule and her carefully maintained composure, he had looked at her for exactly 2 seconds with those storm-gray eyes before pushing himself off the post and walking toward her. "Miss Townsend," he had said. "Mr. Wilcox," she had replied. That had been the entirety of their introduction. He had taken her bag without asking, which could have been presumptuous but somehow was not, and he had helped her up onto the seat of a wagon that had seen considerable use and was not apologizing for it, and they had driven out of town in a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people who are measuring each other with great care. The Wilcox Ranch sat on 500 acres of grassland with a creek running along the eastern boundary, the land flat and golden in October, the sky enormous above it. The house was a proper wood-frame structure, 2 stories, with a porch along the front and a kitchen that extended off the back. It needed paint. The garden alongside it had been half-hearted even in summer and was now mostly resigned. The barn was in better repair than the house, which told her something immediately about the man who owned both. She had barely climbed down from the wagon when the front door of the house had opened, and a small figure had come barreling out with the unstoppable momentum of a child who has been waiting inside for approximately as long as he could stand to wait, which was clearly not very long. Eli Wilcox was 8 years old with his father's dark hair and his father's jaw, but eyes that were warm brown rather than gray, eyes that reminded Caroline of the creek she had just crossed, clear and quick and always moving. He was wearing overalls and no shoes despite the October chill, and he had stopped 3 feet from Caroline and looked up at her with an expression of fierce, concentrated evaluation. "You're the new housekeeper," he had announced. "I am," she had agreed. "Can you make pie?" "I can make several kinds of pie." He had considered this for exactly 3 seconds. "Do you know how to play checkers?" "I have been known to play a respectable game of checkers." He had nodded, solemn as a judge. "All right then." And that, apparently, had been sufficient. Clayton had shown her the house with the brisk efficiency of a man who found the domestic interior of his own life somewhat foreign territory. The parlor was clean but sparse, the furniture solid and practical, the walls bare except for a framed map of Texas, and a single photograph on the mantelpiece that Caroline did not look at directly, but registered in her peripheral vision with the careful instinct of a woman who had learned to gather information without appearing to seek it. The woman in the photograph was young and dark-haired and beautiful, and she was smiling in the formal way that people smiled for photographers, holding very still and trying to look like their best selves. She was holding an infant. She was clearly, unmistakably, no longer living. It was in the quality of the silence around that photograph, in the way neither Clayton nor Eli mentioned it while showing her every other feature of the house. Her name, Caroline would learn much later, had been Margaret. She had died 4 years ago, when Eli was 4, of a fever that moved through Bitter Creek in the summer of 1874 and took 3 people before it burned itself out. Clayton had been out on the south pasture when she died. He had not made it back in time, and that fact had calcified somewhere inside him into something that had never fully softened again. Caroline had settled into the routine of the ranch with the disciplined efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself useful quickly, because useful people were rarely asked too many questions. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. She organized the larder and the linen closet and the chaos of Eli's room, which contained approximately 40% more rocks than any room reasonably should. She helped Eli with his reading lessons in the evenings while Clayton worked at the desk in the corner of the parlor over accounts that seemed to give him consistent difficulty. She was careful. She was professional. She kept the appropriate distances, but the ranch had a way of dissolving distances. On her 3rd morning, she had been up before dawn to start the bread, and Clayton had come into the kitchen still buckling his belt, surprised to find the stove already lit and coffee already on, and he had stopped in the doorway and looked at her with an expression that she could not quite categorize. Not suspicion, not quite gratitude, something more complicated than either. "You don't have to be up this early," he had said. "The bread needs time," she had replied, which was entirely true and also entirely beside the point. He had poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the window and looked out at the dark yard for a long moment before he said, without turning around, "Eli seems to have taken a liking to you." "He's a remarkable boy," she had said, meaning it completely. Clayton had turned then, and in the early light with the coffee cup in his hand and the stove warm between them, he had looked at her for a moment that lasted just a beat longer than professional courtesy required. "He misses having someone," he had said quietly. "Someone constant. Someone who stays." The words had landed in Caroline's chest like stones dropped into still water, and she had felt the ripples move outward and touch things she had been working very hard to keep undisturbed. She had turned back to the bread dough and said, in her most neutral voice, "I intend to do my job well, Mr. Wilcox." And he had nodded and taken his coffee and gone out to the barn, and neither of them had spoken of anything personal again for 4 more days. Those 4 days were full, though, in ways that accumulated into something she had not anticipated. She discovered that Clayton Wilcox was the kind of man who fixed things. Not just fences and equipment, though he fixed those too, but small invisible things that other people had given up on. She watched him spend an entire evening painstakingly repairing a small wooden horse that Eli had broken, the toy that had been, it turned out, one of the last things Margaret had given him before she died. Clayton sat at the kitchen table with the wood glue and the small carved pieces, and worked with the patience of someone dismantling a very delicate bomb, and he did not say anything about what the toy was or why he was fixing it, and Caroline did not ask, but she brought him a cup of coffee and set it beside him and went back to her mending, and he had said, "Thank you," very quietly to the table, and she had felt something shift in the foundation of the careful, temporary structure she was trying to build around herself. She discovered that he was not a hard man in the way that frontier life so often made men hard, that particular calcified selfishness that came from years of nothing giving you anything without a fight. He was contained, yes. He was guarded, certainly. But she saw the way he watched Eli with a vigilance that was indistinguishable from love, saw the way he made sure the boy's jacket was buttoned before he went out in the morning, heard the low murmur of his voice through the wall at night when he went in to check on Eli after the boy was asleep, talking to him quietly the way you talk to someone when you need them to know they are safe. She discovered that he read. There was a shelf of books in the parlor that she had assumed were decorative, the kind of books that frontier families kept for appearances, but they were creased and marked, clearly read multiple times, and one evening she had found him at the desk not doing accounts but reading a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he had caught her looking and closed the book almost defensively, and she had said without thinking, "I love Emerson." And he had looked at her with that complicated expression again and said, "You do," as though the idea surprised him so much it temporarily bypassed his habitual reserve. "There is a difference between voluntary and involuntary attention," she had quoted, one of the lines that had stayed with her. "Emerson said it, but I've found it useful." "Which kind do you use?" he had asked, and the question was much more personal than anything they had exchanged up to that point. She had smiled carefully. "Whichever serves me best at the time." He had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had opened the book again and held it out across the desk, not quite offering it, and said, "Take it if you want. I've read it enough times." She had taken it. She had read half of it that night in the small room off the kitchen that had been designated as hers, and in the margin of one of the pages she had found a penciled note in handwriting that was clearly his, 3 words that she had read and reread until the lamplight guttered. She would agree. She had not known then whether the she meant her or meant Margaret, and the uncertainty had lodged itself somewhere beneath her sternum where it had remained, warm and unresolved. It was on the 5th day that the first real complication arrived. His name was Gerald Prentice, and he was the kind of man who wore his menace so comfortably that most people mistook it for confidence. He was a landowner from the east side of the county, broad and well-dressed by frontier standards, with a reputation that, as Caroline would piece together from careful observation, and the things that the ranch hands said when they thought no one important was listening, included a trail of business dealings that bore a suspicious resemblance to theft conducted through legal mechanisms. He rode up to the ranch on that fifth morning while Clayton was out checking the east fence line, and Caroline was in the yard hanging laundry, and he sat on his horse and looked at her with the particular measuring gaze of a man who has decided that what he is looking at is inventory. "You're the new housekeeper," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said, using the same words she had used with Eli, though to entirely different effect. "Townsend," he said, tasting the name. "You're not from around here." "No," she said simply, and continued hanging the laundry because appearing to be uninterested in a conversation was frequently the best way to end it. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Missouri," she said, because that was true and not the part she was hiding. He considered this. "What brought you all the way out here?" "The advertisement in the Gazette," she said, which was also true and also not the part she was hiding. He seemed to find this answer unsatisfying, which was precisely what she had intended. He looked at the house and then back at her. "You tell Wilcox that Gerald Prentice came by. Tell him we need to have that conversation about the water rights soon." "I'll tell him," she said, and she hung the last sheet and picked up her basket and walked back toward the house without hurrying, because hurrying would have told him something she did not want him to know, which was that his presence made her nervous in a very specific way that had nothing to do with water rights. She had seen Gerald Prentice before. Not here. Not in Texas. In Missouri, 3 years ago, at a dinner party in Jefferson City at which she had been present in her former capacity as the wife of Edward Townsend, who had been a banker and a man of considerable local standing right up until the moment he was not. Right up until the moment it became clear to everyone, including Caroline, that the financial institution he had built was constructed on fraud so elaborate and so thorough that, when it collapsed, it took the savings of 47 families with it. Edward Townsend had died of a heart seizure 2 days before the authorities came to question him, which Caroline had always privately believed was the most convenient piece of timing in the history of inconvenient men. She had been left with nothing, and worse than nothing, she had been left with his name and his reputation and the fury of 47 families who needed someone to blame, and found her a satisfactory target despite the fact that she had known nothing at all, about what he had done. She had left Missouri because staying had become impossible. She had come west because the West was where people went when they needed to become someone else, or more precisely, when they needed to become who they actually were without the weight of who other people had decided they must be. Gerald Prentice had been at that dinner party in Jefferson City. He had spoken briefly with Edward. She did not know if he had been a business associate or merely an acquaintance, but he had been there. And if he recognized her face, then the careful, quiet life she was building here would come apart like wet paper. She was still thinking about this when Clayton returned from the fence line that afternoon, and she delivered the message about Prentice with the neutrality of a telegraph operator, giving him only the information requested and nothing else. Clayton's expression had darkened in a way that was informative. "Prentice," he had said flatly, with the particular tone of someone pronouncing the name of a sustained aggravation. "What did he say exactly?" "Water rights," she had said. "He said you needed to have the conversation soon." Clayton had taken his hat off and run a hand through his dark hair in a gesture that she was already learning to recognize as frustration being managed. "He's been trying to claim access to Willow Creek for 2 years. Says his property line extends to the eastern bank, which would give him the right to divert the flow. If he succeeds, I lose half my water supply for the south pasture." "Does he have legitimate grounds?" she had asked, because she understood lawyers and legal mechanisms better than most people assumed. Clayton had looked at her with a quick, assessing glance. "Depends on who you ask. The survey from 1869 is ambiguous. He's hired a lawyer from Fort Worth. Have you seen the original survey documents?" He had paused. "I have them somewhere. If you can find them," she had said carefully, "I might be able to help you read them. I have some experience with property documents." This was true. It was one of the things she had learned in the years she had been married to a banker, that legal and financial documents rewarded careful reading, that the truth was usually buried somewhere in the language that everyone assumed someone else had already understood. Clayton had looked at her for a long moment. "Where'd you learn that?" "From a husband who believed that a woman who understood documents was less likely to be deceived by them," she had said, and let the past tense of husband do its explanatory work without elaborating, and Clayton had nodded with the tact of a man who understood that some territories were marked and ought to be approached with care. They had found the survey documents that evening, and she had sat at the kitchen table with Clayton beside her, both of them leaning over the yellowed paper in the lamplight, and she had walked him through the language with the focused attention she had once given to Edward's contracts when he had occasionally, in the early years, asked for her opinion. She had found the phrase, buried in the third paragraph of the second addendum, that established the boundary not at the eastern bank but at the center line of the creek, which meant Prentice had no legal access to divert the water at all. Clayton had read the passage she pointed to 3 times, and then he had sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something that was almost entirely open, unguarded in a way that made her chest tighten. "You just saved my ranch," he had said, not dramatically, just as a factual statement. "I just read a document," she had said. "No," he had said quietly. "You understood it. There's a difference." She had felt the warmth of that recognition spread through her in a way she had not expected and was not entirely prepared to manage, and she had looked back at the document and said, "You should take this to a lawyer in town. Have them confirm the reading formally." "I will," he had said, and then, after a pause that contained something she was choosing not to examine too closely, he had said, "Thank you, Caroline." It was the first time he had used her given name. She had gone to bed that night with the sensation of it still present, like the warmth of a fire that had been banked but not extinguished. By the end of the first week, she had stopped feeling like a temporary occupant of the ranch and started feeling something far more dangerous, which was at home. Eli was the primary agent of this transformation. He had appointed himself her guide to every feature of the ranch with a thoroughness that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. He showed her where the best blackberries had grown in summer, the bushes now bare but still fragrant in memory. He showed her the particular section of the creek bank where the bank swallows nested in spring, explaining this with the authority of a naturalist who has conducted several seasons of research. He showed her the old cottonwood near the barn that had been split by lightning years before Eli was born and that had subsequently grown back in 2 directions, and he climbed up into the fork of it and looked down at her and said, "Papa says it's stronger where it was broken. Is that true?" She had looked up at him in the October light, his face serious and waiting, and she had thought about Edward and Missouri and the utter destruction of the life she had thought she was living, and she had said, "I think that might be the most important thing I've ever heard about trees." And Eli had looked enormously satisfied, as though this confirmed a thesis he had been developing. She read to him in the evenings, not the improving text that she suspected he encountered at the small schoolhouse in town, but stories. She had brought 3 books with her in her carpet bag, because there are things a person will carry even when carrying is difficult, and one of them was a collection of adventure stories that she had owned since she was a girl. She read him the stories of explorers and sea captains and unlikely heroes, and Eli listened with the concentrated intensity of someone receiving crucial intelligence, occasionally interrupting to ask extremely specific questions about nautical terminology or the precise weight of a particular type of sword. And she answered when she knew, and said honestly when she did not. And she had looked up once from the page to find Clayton standing in the doorway of the parlor with his hat in his hand, and his face doing something complicated and private, watching his son listen to her read. He had caught her looking and straightened and made some minor domestic remark and gone upstairs, but she had carried the image of his expression for the rest of the evening. On the 8th day, the second complication arrived, which was more personal than the first and cut considerably deeper. She was in the general store in town, purchasing supplies from the list Clayton had given her when she heard her name, her real name, her married name, Mrs. Townsend. She turned slowly, managing her expression with every skill she possessed. The woman standing behind her was named Ruth Alcott, and she was from Jefferson City, and her husband had been one of the 47 families who had lost their savings when Edward Townsend's bank collapsed. Caroline knew this because Ruth had been among the most vocal of the accusers at the time, had written letters to the newspaper, had stood in the street outside the bank, and said things about Caroline that had been heard by everyone and believed by most. Ruth Alcott was looking at her with an expression that moved through surprise into recognition into something harder and colder. "I thought that was you," Ruth said, her voice low but carrying in the quiet store. "I heard you'd left Missouri. I didn't know you'd come all the way to Texas." "Ruth," Caroline said steadily, "I didn't know you were here. My husband's cousin has a farm outside of town. We're visiting." Ruth's eyes moved over Caroline's dress, her position in the store, the list in her hand. "What are you doing here, working?" "Yes," Caroline said simply. "For who?" Caroline kept her voice level. "I have a position as a housekeeper." Something shifted in Ruth's expression, not softening exactly, but becoming more complex. "Are you running from what happened, or did you have nothing to do with it? Because my husband and we lost everything, Caroline, everything." The words landed like stones in a pond, exactly as heavy as they were, and Caroline felt the full weight of guilt that she had been carrying for 3 years settle across her shoulders again, the guilt that was not for anything she had done but for everything that had been done in a name she had shared. "I know," she said quietly. "I am truly sorry for what you lost. I had no knowledge of what Edward was doing. I know that is difficult to believe, and I cannot make you believe it, but it is the truth." Ruth studied her for a long, suspended moment. The store was quiet around them, the clerk at the counter pretending to be very busy with inventory. "I believe you didn't know," Ruth said finally, and the words came out with the stiffness of something that had been held for a long time and was only now being released. "I always believed that, actually. It was easier to be angry at someone living." She looked away. "Does anyone here know who you were?" "I am who I was," Caroline said. "I am just no longer married to him." Ruth considered this. "Does anyone know you were the wife of Edward Townsend?" "No." Ruth looked at her for another moment and then said, "Good," with the finality of a decision being made and settled, and she turned and walked out of the store, and Caroline stood very still until she was certain her legs would hold her, and then she purchased her supplies and drove back to the ranch with her hands steady on the reins and her mind a quiet, controlled storm. She had not told Clayton. She had not told anyone. But that night, lying in her small room with the creak audible through the window and the stars visible through the glass in their cold, enormous profusion, she had lain awake for a long time and listened to the silence of the ranch and thought about what it meant to be given a second chance and whether she had the courage to actually take one. The second week brought a warmth to the October evenings that felt borrowed from somewhere more generous, and with it came a gradual dissolution of the careful professional boundaries that Caroline had been maintaining like fences on disputed land. It began with dinner. She had made a proper pot roast, the first substantial meal beyond the routine cooking she had been producing, a pot roast with root vegetables and fresh bread and an apple pie, and Clayton had come in from the evening chores to find the table set properly, and the kitchen smelling of everything that houses are supposed to smell like, and he had stopped in the doorway for a moment with an expression she had not seen before, something that was raw and unguarded and quickly covered, but she had seen it. "Sit down," she said quietly. "Both of you. It's ready." Eli needed no further invitation and was in his chair with his hands folded in approximately 3 seconds. Clayton sat down across from his son, and Caroline brought the food to the table, and for a moment she intended to take her plate to the kitchen, which was what she had been doing, maintaining the professional separation of hired help from household. "Sit with us," Eli said, with the directness of someone who has not yet learned to frame requests as questions when what they mean is commands. She had looked at Clayton across the table. "Please," Clayton had said, and the word was quiet and without elaboration, and she had pulled out the chair at the end of the table and sat down, and the three of them had eaten together, and it had felt, in a way that she knew she should not permit herself to feel, completely right. The conversation at dinner that night was easy in a way that startled her. Eli talked about the horses and about a hawk he had seen near the barn that had a wing that looked wrong, maybe injured, and about a disagreement he had with his friend Thomas at school regarding whether a person could actually survive 3 days in the desert without water. Clayton had opinions about all of these topics delivered with the quiet directness of a man who said exactly what he thought and no more. He had asked Caroline about her childhood, and she had answered honestly, describing the small town in Ohio where she had grown up, the mother who taught her to cook and the father who taught her to read, the particular kind of industrious practicality that had been the central ethic of her upbringing. And Clayton had listened with the full, unhurried attention of someone who is genuinely interested and is not performing interest for social reasons. After dinner, after Eli was in bed, they had lingered at the kitchen table over coffee in a way that had not happened before, both of them finding reasons to stay in the warm kitchen rather than retreat to their respective solitudes. "The lawyer in town confirmed the survey reading," Clayton said. "You were right about the boundary line. Prentice doesn't have a legal case." "Good," she said. "He won't accept it quietly," Clayton said. "Men like Prentice don't lose gracefully." "No," she agreed. "They look for other pressure points." Clayton looked at her over his coffee cup. "You know men like Prentice." It was not quite a question. She met his eyes. "I have encountered the type." He held her gaze for a moment. "You don't talk much about where you were before this." "No," she said simply. He nodded slowly, and she had the sense that he was weighing whether to press further and deciding against it, not from lack of curiosity but from respect for the unspoken agreement that some territories were marked, that privacy was a right rather than a concealment. "Fair enough," he said. "I don't talk much about some things either." "I know," she said softly, and for a moment they simply sat in the warmth of the kitchen with the October wind outside and the lamp between them. And it was, she thought, one of the most honest moments she had experienced in years. The weeks that followed were a gradual accumulation, the kind of falling that happens slowly enough that you don't notice each individual inch of descent until you look down and discover you have already arrived somewhere entirely different from where you started. She noticed the way Clayton watched the weather with the anxious attention of a man whose livelihood was entirely dependent on what the sky decided to do. She noticed the way he treated his ranch hands, 3 men who worked for him seasonally, with a respect that was not universally practiced in the territory, and that the men clearly responded to with a loyalty that money alone could not have purchased. She noticed that he never raised his voice. She noticed that he was funny, quietly, unexpectedly in moments when his guard was down far enough to let it through, a dry observation delivered in such a deadpan tone that it took her a full 3 seconds the first time to understand it was a joke, and she had laughed before she could decide whether to. He had looked startled by her laughter, and then deeply, almost shyly pleased. She noticed the way he looked at her. She had been careful to ignore it, because looking at the way Clayton Wilcox looked at her required acknowledging things she was not yet certain she had the right to feel, given the secrets she was keeping and the uncertainty of her own situation. But it was there, consistent as weather, this particular quality of attention he gave to her that was different from the attention he gave to anything else. When she entered a room he was in, something in his posture changed, subtly, the way a compass needle adjusts when it comes near its north. She found that she was adjusting her own compass in response, in spite of herself. The crisis came in the 3rd week, on a Tuesday morning that had begun as ordinarily as any other. Gerald Prentice came to the ranch again, and this time he came with information. He arrived while Clayton was in town, and she was alone at the ranch with Eli, who was home from school with a cold that had been developing since Sunday. She answered the knock at the front door and found Prentice on the porch, and this time he was smiling in a way that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Mrs. Townsend," he said, and the emphasis on the Mrs. was deliberate. "Or do you prefer to go by Miss these days?" She kept her face completely still. "What do you want, Mr. Prentice?" "I remember you," he said pleasantly. "Jefferson City, your late husband's dinner party, 1875. He tilted his head. "Edward Townsend's wife." "My husband is deceased," she said. "He is," Prentice agreed. "Terribly convenient that. Died just before the investigation. Left you to deal with the aftermath." He paused. "Or left you to run from it, as the case may be." "I am working honestly," she said, "which is more than I can say for some." The pleasantness in his expression sharpened slightly. "Does Wilcox know who you are? Does he know the woman he hired to look after his son was the wife of one of the biggest frauds in Missouri history?" Caroline's heart was hammering, but her voice stayed level. "Does he know that his water rights survey legally invalidates your claim to Willow Creek?" she said quietly. "Because his lawyer in town does, as of last week." Prentice's smile did not disappear exactly, but it became something colder. "That's a temporary setback. It is a permanent legal determination," she said. "Good day, Mr. Prentice." She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a full 30 seconds, listening to the sound of his horse departing, and then she went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and made herself think. Because this was the moment she had been trying to prevent, and it had arrived anyway, as the things you most dread generally do when you've spent enough energy trying to delay them. Prentice would tell Clayton. That was certain. The only question was whether Clayton would hear it first from Prentice, with whatever spin Prentice chose to put on it, or whether he would hear it from her. She was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of tea she had not tasted when she heard the wagon come into the yard. Clayton came through the kitchen door with supplies from town and stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said, setting the supplies down immediately. She set her cup on the counter. She looked at him directly because she owed him that much, and she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you decide what to think." He pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down across the table from where she was standing, and he folded his hands on the table and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes steady and entirely attentive. And she took a breath that felt like the last one before stepping off a precipice, and she told him. She told him about Edward, about the marriage, about the bank, about the collapse. She told him about the 47 families. She told him about leaving Missouri with $4.32 and a name that had become a liability. She told him about Ruth Alcott in the general store. She told him that she had known nothing about the fraud, and she told him she understood if he found that impossible to believe, and she told him that Prentice had been to the ranch this morning and had recognized her, and that he would likely use this information as leverage against Clayton. Throughout all of this, Clayton did not move and did not speak. His expression was controlled in the way that his expressions always were when he was working through something large and complicated, and when she had finished, she stood very still and waited because there was nothing more to do. He was quiet for a long time. "Did you know," he asked finally, "anything at all about what he was doing?" "No," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I believe you," he said. The relief of those 3 words was so sudden and so complete that she had to grip the edge of the counter. "Clayton, you should have told me sooner," he said, not harshly but directly. "Not because it changes anything about who you are or what you've done here, but because I would have been prepared for Prentice. I could have helped protect you from this." She stared at him. He was not angry at her for the secret. He was frustrated at himself for not being given the opportunity to defend her. "I wasn't certain you'd believe me," she said honestly. "I wasn't certain you wouldn't send me away." He stood up from the chair, and he was close now, closer than he had been in any of their conversations, and his eyes were very serious. "I don't make decisions about people based on things they didn't do," he said. "You've done nothing wrong here. You built a life in honest work after a disaster that wasn't your fault. He paused. And Eli, he stopped. I know, she said quietly. I'm sorry if my being here has complicated things. Caroline, he said, and her name and his voice had a quality now that was different from every previous time, something that was not professional at all, something that was stripped of the careful management he usually applied to himself. You haven't complicated things. You have made things better than they've been in 4 years, and I don't want you to go anywhere. She felt the words land in her chest and take root. Prentice will use this, she said. He'll tell people in town. He'll find a way to make it damage you. Let him try, Clayton said, and there was a quiet certainty in his voice that she recognized as the kind of courage that does not announce itself. I'll go see the sheriff tomorrow and tell him the situation before Prentice can spin it. And anyone in this town who knows me knows what kind of man Prentice is. You do that, she asked. It's the truth, he said simply. I'll always do what's true. And then, because the moment was open, and because he was the kind of man who did what was true even when it was difficult, he had said, quietly, I should also tell you that my reasons for wanting you to stay are not entirely professional. She looked at him. I am aware, he said carefully, that you are employed in my house, and that makes this complicated. I'm aware that I'm a widower with a son and a ranch that's in a permanent argument with the weather, and that none of those are particularly attractive circumstances. But I am also honest enough to tell you that what has happened in the past 3 weeks has changed something for me that I didn't expect to be changed again, and I thought you should know that. She said nothing for a moment, and then she said, I am aware that my circumstances are not exactly straightforward either. No, he agreed, and there was the briefest ghost of that rare smile. They're not. But, she said, and she allowed herself to look at him without the careful management she had been practicing, allowed herself to be entirely honest in a way that felt terrifying and completely necessary. I think I should tell you that something has changed for me as well, and I have not felt that in a long time. He looked at her, and the thing that passed between them in that kitchen in the October light was not a declaration, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement, and it was real, and it was the beginning of something they both understood was going to require courage to continue. That was when Eli appeared in the doorway in his nightgown, his nose red from his cold, his hair disordered from sleep, looking at them with the alert suspicion of a child who has sensed that something important is happening in his proximity. What's going on? Eli demanded. Nothing, said both adults simultaneously, and the very simultaneity of it made Eli look back and forth between them with renewed suspicion. You look like you've been talking about something serious, Eli said. Adults have serious conversations sometimes, Clayton said. About what? About various things, Caroline said, which satisfied no one. Eli narrowed his eyes at both of them in turn, and then he said with the devastating directness that was his greatest gift, Are you going to stay, Miss Caroline? Because Thomas at school says that housekeepers don't stay very long. She looked at Clayton over the boy's head. I intend to stay, she said, looking at Eli but meaning it for both of them, for as long as I'm wanted. You're wanted, Eli said immediately and emphatically, as if this were the simplest thing in the world because for him it was. The confrontation with Prentice came, as Clayton had predicted, through the social channels of the town rather than through direct action. Within 2 days, there were murmurs. People in Bitter Creek had heard something about the new housekeeper at the Wilcox Ranch, something about Missouri, something about a bank. Caroline heard it in the quality of the silences at the general store, in the careful way certain women at the Sunday service did not quite meet her eyes. Clayton went to speak with the sheriff as he had said he would, presenting the facts plainly. Caroline had been the wife of a man who committed fraud. She had not been a party to the fraud. She was now a widow working honestly and without deception. The sheriff, a pragmatic man named Walt Granger, who had little patience for social politics and considerable respect for Clayton Wilcox, had listened and nodded, and said that as far as he was concerned, there was no criminal matter to address, and that anyone who said otherwise was welcome to bring him a law they believed had been broken. It was Ruth Alcott who, unexpectedly, served as the most effective voice in Caroline's defense. Ruth had apparently spoken at the social gathering at the church with the same directness she had brought to her accusations 3 years ago, and she had said that she had encountered Caroline Townsend in Bitter Creek, and that in her personal knowledge and experience, Caroline had been entirely ignorant of her husband's activities, that the courts in Missouri had found the same, and that persecuting a woman for the sins of a dead man was neither Christian nor fair, and she would say so to anyone who suggested otherwise. Caroline had heard this secondhand from the wife of one of the ranch hands, and she had stood in the kitchen and felt something release in her chest that had been held tight for 3 years, the particular tension of waiting for the worst to happen, of carrying something that did not belong to her, and finally being told she could put it down. She had cried quietly in her room that evening, not from sadness, but from the sheer physical relief of being seen clearly and found innocent of something she had never done. Clayton had knocked on her door that evening, which he had never done before, and when she had answered, her eyes clearly reddened. He had looked at her face and said nothing, but had reached into his jacket pocket and produced a clean handkerchief, which he held out to her with the careful formality of a man who was doing the most tender thing he knew how to do. And she had taken it, and he had stood in the hallway and waited until she was composed, and then he had said, "Supper's getting cold." And she had followed him to the kitchen, and they had eaten with Eli between them, and the normalcy of it had been the kindest possible thing he could have given her. November came with a sharpness that turned the creek edges to ice in the mornings and made the evenings long and close, and with it came a deepening of everything that had been tentatively begun between Caroline and Clayton. They talked more. Not the carefully managed exchanges of employer and employee, but the real conversations of two people who have decided to let the other one in, slowly, in pieces, with the attention of people who understand that trust is built not in single gestures, but in the accumulation of small, consistent truths. He told her about Margaret. Not everything, not all at once, but in the way that you circle a difficult subject, approaching and retreating, each pass bringing you a little closer. He told her about how they had met at a church social in a town 60 miles south, how he had been immediately lost and had spent the first 4 months of their acquaintance trying to hide it. He told her about the fever, the summer of 1874, about coming in from the pasture to find the house wrong, too quiet, and finding Eli alone and frightened in the kitchen with a neighbor woman who had been summoned too late. He told her about the particular texture of grief that is also guilt, the conviction that if he had been there it might have been different, which he knew rationally was not true, and which he felt emotionally with undiminished force regardless. She had listened to all of it with the full attention she had given to everything else about him, and when he was done she had said quietly, "She sounds like someone who was exactly right for the life you were building." She was, he said, and then the life changed shape. "Lives do," she said. He had looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he had said, "they do." She had told him more about herself, too. About Ohio and the industrious parents who had raised her to be competent and capable, and not to require rescuing, which had made the experience of being rescued by geography all the more personally disorienting. About the early years with Edward, when she had genuinely believed the life they were building was real, before the slow, gradual accumulation of small inconsistencies that she had explained away one by one, until there were too many to explain and she stopped trying. About the awful particular loneliness of being deceived by someone you trusted, which was different from other kinds of loneliness. Clayton had listened to all of it with the same complete attention he gave to everything that mattered to him, and when she was done he had said, "You are one of the most capable people I have ever met, and it seems to me that you have spent a considerable amount of your life having that capability dismissed by people who should have known better." It was the most perceptive thing anyone had said to her in years, and she had not trusted her voice with an immediate response. So she had only looked at him, and he had held her gaze steadily, and the moment had lasted long enough to be something more than a moment. On a cold Saturday in early November, they went to town together for supplies. The three of them, Eli wedged between them on the wagon seat, providing continuous commentary on every feature of the landscape. In the general store, Mrs. Henderson, who ran the shop, had greeted Caroline with the easy warmth of someone who had decided she was a permanent fixture and was glad of it. And Eli had been allowed to choose a stick of peppermint from the jar. And Clayton had stood beside Caroline while she selected fabric for a new curtain for the kitchen, and had given opinions when asked with a seriousness that suggested he considered this a genuine architectural decision. Walking back to the wagon, Eli had taken both their hands simultaneously, one in each of his, and had swung between them with the casual confidence of a child who does not doubt his right to the thing he is taking. And Caroline had looked past Eli's swinging head at Clayton and found him already looking at her. And the expression on his face was completely unguarded, open in a way that she had only seen in flashes before, and that now lasted long enough to be read clearly. And what it said was something she had not thought she would find again in a life that had seemed determined to take all the things she had believed in. It said, "You." The question came on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of November, on a day that had started with church and a long, slow dinner, and an afternoon that drifted warm and golden despite the season, the kind of afternoon that wraps itself around you like something you want to keep. Clayton had been working on a piece of harness leather on the porch steps, and Caroline had been mending on the porch bench, and Eli had been playing in the yard with the wooden figures he carved with the small knife Clayton had given him for his birthday, tiny horses, and cattle that he arranged in elaborate configurations that only he fully understood. The afternoon had the quality of peace, the real kind, not the absence of trouble but the presence of something that made trouble seem small and manageable. And Eli had looked up from his horses and looked at his father and asked the question, "Papa, can Miss Caroline be our family? Can she stay here forever and be our mama?" The question rang out across the yard and struck Clayton somewhere so deep that he did not immediately move. And Caroline, who had gone completely still on the porch bench, watched a series of things move across his face in rapid succession, surprise, and something so tender it was almost painful to witness, and something that looked very much like recognition, the expression of a man who has just been told by an 8-year-old what he already knew. He looked from Eli to Caroline, and she saw in his eyes that he could not say no to either one of them. Not to his son, who was looking at him with all of his enormous, earnest heart visible on his face, asking for the thing he had been missing for 4 years with the directness of someone who had not yet learned that wanting things makes you vulnerable. And not to Caroline, who was sitting very still on the porch bench with her mending forgotten in her hands, and her heart hammering against her ribs and her eyes bright with something she had stopped trying to hide. Clayton stood up from the porch steps slowly, and he turned to face Caroline directly, and he said, in a voice that was very quiet and very steady, "Eli is asking because he already knows what I want. He has always understood things before I say them." She searched his face. "Clayton, I love you," he said, plainly and without performance, the way he said everything true. "I have been falling in love with you since you read that survey document by lamplight and explained it to me like it mattered, and it has only gotten more complete since then. I know your situation is complicated and my situation is complicated, and this is not a conventional—" "Stop," she said softly and stood up. She walked toward him, across the porch, down the steps, and she stood in front of him in the November yard with Eli watching them with transparent jubilation from his position beside the wooden horses, and she said, "I love you too. I think I have been trying not to since approximately the moment you fixed that wooden horse for your son at the kitchen table." His hands came up and cupped her face with the same careful precision he brought to fixing things that mattered, and he looked at her for a long moment with those storm-gray eyes that were not stormy at all when they looked at her, that were the color of the sky after rain, clear and washed and entirely open. He kissed her in the November yard while his son watched with enormous satisfaction, and it was warm and certain and entirely honest, the kind of kiss that does not announce itself as the beginning of something grand, but simply is, simply exists, complete and real. Eli made a sound that was somewhere between a cheer and a sigh of enormous personal vindication. They broke apart, and Caroline found herself laughing, genuinely laughing, in a way that felt like something coming back to life. "Does this mean yes?" Eli demanded, approaching with the focused intensity of a negotiator reaching the final clause. Clayton looked at Caroline with a question in his eyes that was the same question rephrased in the language of adults, asking whether she was certain, whether this was what she wanted, giving her the choice cleanly and without pressure even now. She looked at the ranch around them, at the house that needed paint and the garden that needed attention and the creek audible in the distance and the enormous Texas sky, and she looked at Eli with his earnest face and his tiny wooden horses, and she looked at Clayton, who was watching her with everything he felt visible in his expression for once, not managed or contained but simply present. "Yes," she said clearly. "This means yes." Eli launched himself at both of them simultaneously and was caught, laughing, between them, and Clayton's arm went around Caroline's shoulders and pulled her close, and the three of them stood in the November yard in a tangle of relief and happiness, and the particular rightness of something that has arrived exactly when it was meant to. The engagement was not a long one. Clayton proposed formally 3 days later, with a ring that had been his mother's, a small gold band with a garnet that he had kept in the locked box in his desk, and he had asked her properly in the kitchen, after Eli was in bed, on one knee on the kitchen floor with the lamp between them and the November wind outside, and she had said yes with a steadiness in her voice that contained everything she felt and a brightness in her eyes that said the rest. They were married in December, in the small church in Bitter Creek, by the same minister who had preached at Margaret's funeral 4 years before, which was acknowledged by everyone present with the kind of layered feeling that only happens when life circles back to the same places carrying different things. The day was cold and bright, the sky the hard blue of deep winter, and Caroline wore a dress of deep green wool that she had made herself, and Clayton wore the suit he had worn on one previous occasion that anyone in Bitter Creek could recall, and Eli was the self-appointed coordinator of all logistical arrangements, having strong opinions about where people should stand and what order things should happen in. The sheriff attended, as did the ranch hands and Mrs. Henderson from the general store, and several families from the surrounding ranches who had come to know Caroline in the weeks since her arrival and had decided she was exactly the kind of person the Wilcox household needed. Ruth Alcott was there too, having extended her visit, and she and Caroline had embraced briefly before the service in a moment that contained an entire conversation that did not need to be spoken. The ceremony itself was simple and entirely sincere, the kind of vows that mean what they say, and when Clayton took her hand and looked at her and spoke his promises in the quiet church, she felt the last of the weight she had been carrying since Missouri leave her, not dramatically, not in a rush, but gently, like something finally allowed to set itself down. She spoke her promises back to him in a voice that was clear and steady and entirely her own. Outside the church, in the bright cold December air, Eli stood between them and announced to no one in particular and everyone in general, "We're a family now," with the gravity of an official proclamation, and Clayton picked him up and held him in one arm and put his other arm around Caroline, and the three of them stood in the winter light with the whole of Texas spreading out around them, and it was true. Life on the ranch settled into a new shape over the following months, a shape that was larger and warmer and considerably more organized than its previous version. Caroline brought the domestic life of the house into a state of genuine order without dismantling the character of it. The books on the shelf, the map on the parlor wall, the repaired wooden horse on Eli's windowsill. She expanded the kitchen garden in the spring with the energetic assistance of Eli, who turned out to have strong opinions about what should be planted where, and was an unexpectedly capable digger. She continued to help Clayton with the accounts and the ranch paperwork, because she was good at it, and because it was satisfying work, and because the two of them at the kitchen table in the evenings with the lamp between them, working through numbers and planning, was one of her favorite places to be. The water rights dispute with Prentice had been formally settled in Clayton's favor by the county court in January, a decision delivered with the finality of law and received by Prentice with visible ill grace. He had not, after the wedding, made any further attempts to use Caroline's history as leverage, partly because there was no longer any leverage to be had, and partly because the combined social standing of Clayton Wilcox and the evident support of people like the sheriff and Ruth Alcott had made such tactics not merely ineffective but actively counterproductive. Prentice had retreated to the east side of the county to nurse his grievances in private, and Bitter Creek continued its unremarkable and functional existence without reference to him. Eli was the most thoroughly happy person in the county that spring. He had a mother. He had negotiated this outcome himself, and he was not above reminding people of this fact when the conversation called for it, which in his estimation it called for fairly frequently. He had a mother who read to him and answered his questions about hawks and deserts and the tensile strength of old cottonwood trees, and who made several kinds of pie, and who played checkers with him with genuine competitiveness, rather than the condescending leniency of an adult who was letting him win, which he had always found offensive. He flourished in a way that was visible, that showed in the way he moved through the world with a confidence that had previously been present but uncertain, like a fire that has been given sufficient air. Caroline and Clayton flourished too, in the particular way of people who have found each other after long difficulty and who understand the value of what they have. They were not people given to grand gestures. Their love expressed itself in the dailiness of things, in the coffee that was always ready when the other came in the way Clayton reached for her hand on the wagon seat without thinking about it, in the evenings at the kitchen table, and the long Sunday afternoons on the porch, and the conversations that moved between the serious and the light with the ease of long familiarity. They also, in the privacy of their marriage, discovered each other in ways that had nothing to do with dailiness, and everything to do with the particular intimacy of two people who have been genuinely seen by someone for the first time, and are savoring the experience with complete and mutual devotion. In the summer of 1879, the summer after they married, they discovered that their family was going to grow. Caroline told Clayton on a July evening when the air smelled of grass and the creek was audible through the open window, told him with a directness that he had come to love about her, looking at him steadily over the kitchen table and saying, "I believe we are going to have a child." He had been very still for a moment, and then he had gotten up from the table and come to where she was sitting and crouched down so that his eyes were level with hers, and he had looked at her with an expression so full it was difficult to look at directly, and he had said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I am perfectly well," she had said. He had taken her hands, "Caroline," and then nothing more because there was not a word sufficient to contain what he was feeling, so he had let the word of her name do all the work. She had put her forehead against his. "Are you happy?" "I am," he said, "more than I know how to say." Eli received this information the following morning at breakfast with a seriousness that lasted approximately 45 seconds before exploding into a series of very specific questions about the logistics of babies and their domestic requirements. Then announced that he hoped it would be a brother, because he already understood girls adequately from school, and a brother would be more interesting territory. The child was born in March of 1880. A boy, arriving in the blue-cold early morning with all the decisive punctuality of someone who has a schedule to keep. Clayton had been present throughout, which was not the universal practice, but was the only option he was willing to consider, present and steady, and entirely focused on Caroline, in the way that he was entirely focused on things that mattered. And when the doctor placed the baby in his arms, he had held him with the careful, awed precision of someone holding something irreplaceable. They named him James Henry Wilcox after Caroline's father, and he was from his first day a person with decided views about the world around him, dark-haired like his father and Eli, with Caroline's green eyes, and a voice that, when he chose to use it, could be heard from a considerable distance. Eli approached his new brother with the focused assessment of a researcher, encountering a new subject, and informed James, who was 4 days old and could only blink in response, that there would be an educational curriculum beginning as soon as James demonstrated sufficient cognitive capacity, and that in the meantime Eli would be responsible for all the interesting outdoor activities and James could concentrate on growing. The ranch continued to grow alongside the family. Clayton expanded the cattle operation in 1880 with the money they had carefully saved through 2 good seasons, purchasing additional grazing land on the south side of Willow Creek that gave them more range and more water access. Caroline managed the household accounts with the same clear-eyed precision she had brought to the survey document that first month, and the ranch operated more efficiently than it ever had, not because Clayton had been deficient before, but because 2 competent people working together produce more than the sum of their individual efforts. The community of Bitter Creek had by 1880 entirely absorbed Caroline Wilcox as a permanent and valued feature. She organized the reading circle at the church with the minister's enthusiastic support. She helped start a small lending library using donated books, including the collection from the Wilcox Parlor, supplemented by purchases from a bookseller in Fort Worth. She was the person that women in the county came to when they needed advice on legal documents or household management, or simply someone who would listen carefully and respond honestly. And she gave all of these things without reservation. She understood, happy. Not in the uncomplicated way of someone who has never experienced unhappiness, but in the richer, more durable way of someone who knows exactly what it cost and values it accordingly. Clayton understood this too. He understood it in the way he had come to understand most things about Caroline, not through declaration but through attention, through the long practice of watching her and listening to her, and thinking about what he observed with the seriousness he brought to things that were important to him. One evening in the spring of 1881, when James was just over a year old and walking with the determined, slightly unstable confidence of someone who has recently discovered a major new skill and is committed to applying it constantly, and Eli was upstairs studying for an examination at school with the focused intensity he brought to intellectual competition. Clayton and Caroline were sitting on the porch in the spring evening with the creek audible, and the fireflies just beginning, and the enormous Texas sky darkening through shades of gold and rose and deep blue above them. He reached over and took her hand, which he did often and without ceremony, and he held it in the way he held things he was taking care of. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I was 34 years old when you arrived at this ranch," he said, "and I had decided, not consciously but in the way that you decide things without meaning to, that the life I was going to live from that point onward was going to be a smaller life, a good life, a sufficient life, but smaller." He paused, looking out at the darkening land. "You made it larger again, every part of it, and I am grateful to you in a way that I am not sure I have the right words for." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. "You gave me a place to be real," she said finally. "After years of being someone else's version of who I was, and then years of running from even that, you looked at all of it and you said, 'I believe you and I want you to stay,' and that was the most generous thing anyone has ever done for me." He squeezed her hand. "Also," she said, with the quieter, warmer edge in her voice that he loved best. "You make excellent coffee, and you fix that wooden horse at the kitchen table, and I think I loved you from about that moment, and simply required several weeks to admit it." He turned to look at her with the expression that she had seen first as a flash and then as a longer light and now as a constant, steady, reliable warmth that she navigated by as certainly as the stars. "Several weeks," he said dryly. "Several," she confirmed. He laughed, the low, genuine laugh that had the same effect on her that it had always had, and pulled her close against his side in the spring evening, and she settled against him with the ease of someone who has found the place in the world that is specifically theirs. And they sat together on the porch of the ranch. They were building into something real and lasting, listening to the creek and the early insects and the distant sound of Eli's voice upstairs, reading his lesson aloud to himself as he had taken to doing, and the occasional emphatic syllable from James, who was practicing language with enthusiasm, if not yet with precision. The spring moved into summer and summer into another autumn, and the Wilcox ranch continued its life. There were hard seasons and easy ones, because that was the nature of the land. There were cattle lost to a harsh winter in 1882 and a fence line destroyed by flooding in the spring that followed it. There were medical bills when Eli broke his wrist, falling out of the lightning-split cottonwood that he had been told repeatedly was not safe to climb, a prohibition he received with respect and applied to others, but did not technically apply to himself. There were good seasons with strong cattle prices and bumper kitchen gardens and evenings of such uncomplicated pleasantness that Caroline sometimes had to resist the superstitious impulse to look around for what might be preparing to take it away. Nothing took it away. That was the thing she had not quite believed was possible, after Missouri, after Edward, after the long, uncertain road that had delivered her dusty and near penniless to the yard of a ranch in West Texas. That the good thing, once found, could actually stay, could persist through difficulty and weather and time and remain itself, remain good, remain true. In the autumn of 1883, they discovered that their family would grow again. Caroline told Clayton in the kitchen on a September evening with the lamp between them and the account spread on the table, told him with the directness that had always been hers, and he had done what he had done before, come to where she was and taken her hands and looked at her with the full weight of what he felt entirely visible. "I am hoping," she said, watching his face, "for a girl this time." "Whatever comes," he said, "will be exactly right." The baby arrived in May of 1884, a girl, arriving in the golden warmth of a spring morning with the window open and the cottonwoods audible in the breeze outside. They named her Lucy Margaret, the second name for a woman who had been loved and was still always a part of the life that continued. Eli, who was now 14 and had grown into a serious, quietly brilliant young man, who was already talking about whether the Territorial College in Austin might have a program suited to his interests, held his baby sister with the same careful attention his father brought to things that mattered and declared her acceptable, which from Eli was approximately equivalent to anyone else's declaration of unconditional love. James, who was 4 and in possession of strong opinions about most things, examined Lucy with the deep suspicion of a person whose territory has been altered without adequate consultation, and then, with the pragmatic adaptability that had always been one of his most charming features, decided that she would probably be interesting once she could do something useful, and went back to his horses. That evening, after the children were asleep, Clayton sat on the edge of the bed beside Caroline and looked at Lucy in the small cradle that had held both Eli and James and now held her, and he was very quiet for a long time. "What are you thinking?" Caroline asked softly. He turned to look at her, and she saw on his face everything she had come to know as his truth, the love and the depth of it and the gratitude for it, and beneath all of that the particular quality of a man who has been given more than he expected and has the wisdom to know it. "I am thinking," he said, "that Eli was right." She raised her eyebrows. "He asked you if you could be our family," Clayton said. He was 8 years old, and he already understood what I was going to spend the next 6 years being grateful, he said out loud. He looked back at Lucy, who was making the small, continuous sounds of a person who has recently arrived somewhere new and is taking stock of the situation. "He has always been ahead of me in that way." Caroline smiled, the full, unguarded smile that she kept for moments that were only his. "He is remarkable," she said. "He is," Clayton agreed. "But so are you." He looked at her again. "So are you." She reached for his hand and held it in both of hers, and they sat together in the lamplight with their daughter between them and the ranch quiet around them and the Texas night enormous and full outside the window, and it was everything. The Wilcox family went on. Eli went to Austin and came back with a degree in law and set up a practice in Bitter Creek that served the county with the same thorough, principled attention he had brought to everything since he was 8 years old, and evaluating housekeepers on the basis of pie-making and checkers. He married a young woman from a ranch east of town who was equal to him in intelligence and exceeded him in patience, which was the precise combination he required, and they gave Clayton and Caroline grandchildren who were, by universal family agreement, extraordinary. James grew into a man who loved the ranch with the particular devotion of someone who has known it since before he could walk, and he began working it alongside Clayton as soon as he was old enough to be genuinely useful, learning every acre of it with the focused thoroughness of someone who intends to inherit it as a responsibility rather than a gift. He was, in the way of the second child who finds the first child occupying the intellectual territory, the one who understood the land in his hands and his body rather than in theory, and he was good at it in a way that made Clayton quietly proud every single day. Lucy grew up between 2 brothers and 2 parents who loved her completely, and a ranch that taught her everything about the land and the seasons, and the particular stubbornness required to build a life in a place that does not make it easy, and she was fierce and warm and funny and entirely herself. Caroline taught all 3 of them to read carefully and think critically and ask honest questions and give honest answers, and she taught them these things not by instruction, but by being consistently the kind of person who read carefully and thought critically and asked honest questions and gave honest answers, which is the only method that actually works. And Clayton, who had been a good man before and was a better one after, who had learned from loving Caroline that being known completely by someone, and loved anyway, was not a vulnerability but a foundation, went on being the kind of man who fixed things. Not just fences and equipment, though he fixed those too, but the invisible things, the things that other people had given up on, steadily and without announcement, for all the years that were given to him. They grew old together on the ranch that had been built by his hands and shaped by hers and inhabited by all of them. And the house got painted eventually, twice, and the kitchen garden became one of the finest in the county, and the bookshelves in the parlor were supplemented, and then exceeded and required the addition of a second set of shelves, and the creek ran along the eastern boundary every spring and every summer and every autumn and every winter, steady and cool and reliable. The lightning-split cottonwood near the barn, the one that had grown back in 2 directions, and that Eli had climbed on the 3rd day Caroline was at the ranch, continued to stand. Stronger where it had been broken, the way he had told her. The way she had told him was possibly the most important thing she had ever heard about trees. It was. In the evenings, when the ranch was settled and the children were grown, and the grandchildren came on weekends to fill the house with noise and mud, and the specific chaos of people who are entirely loved, Clayton and Caroline sat on the porch in the same way they had always sat on the porch, his hand finding hers without looking, the creek audible in the distance, the Texas sky doing what it had always done, enormous and various and entirely indifferent to human affairs and entirely beautiful regardless. She was content in a way that she had not known was available to her, a contentment not of stasis but of rightness, the feeling of a life that had found its true shape after years of being forced into shapes that did not fit. She was known here, fully and honestly and without reservation. She was loved in the way that matters most, not despite her complexity but including it, not around her history but through it, not as the version of herself she had constructed for other people's comfort but as the actual woman, Caroline Townsend Wilcox, Ohio-born, Missouri-scarred, West Texas-rooted, and entirely at home. And beside her in the gathering Texas evening was the man who had not been able to say no to either one of them, who had chosen truth in every direction it pointed and had arrived, by that choosing, here. Here, which was exactly right. Here, which was enough. Here, which was everything.